In 1931, a man named Shirley Jones walked out of a tunnel in West Virginia, coughing so hard he couldn't stand upright. He was 32 years old. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been healthy enough to swing a sledgehammer 10 hours a day. Now his lungs felt like they were filled with ground glass. Because they were. Shirley Jones would be dead within the year. So would his brother. So would 474 other men, at minimum. Some estimates put the real number closer to 764. We'll never know the exact count because the company that killed them destroyed most of the records. And here is what makes this story unlike any other industrial disaster in American history. The company that killed these men knew exactly what was happening. They had the medical reports. They saw the bodies. They watched workers drop dead on the tunnel floor. Sometimes mid-swing, still clutching their drills, and they did nothing. Worse than nothing. They sped up the work, they refused to provide masks, they threatened to fire anyone who complained, and when the dying workers could no longer stand, they were dragged out of the tunnel and left in company shacks to suffocate on their own lung tissue, while foremen recruited fresh bodies to replace them. No one was ever arrested. No executive ever saw the inside of a courtroom. The company lawyer who orchestrated the cover-up went on to become a federal judge. The total settlement paid to the families of the dead came to roughly $130,000, split among hundreds of widows and orphans that worked out to less than the cost of a used car per corpse. This is the story of the Hawks Nest Tunnel, the deadliest industrial disaster in American history. A mass grave hidden in the mountains of West Virginia, and a crime so enormous that 8 decades later, we still haven't fully reckoned with what happened in that darkness beneath Gauley Mountain. To understand how 476 men were killed in plain sight, with full knowledge of everyone involved, you need to understand the world they walked into in 1930. The Great Depression had just begun. Banks were failing across the country. Factories that had run 3 shifts were now padlocking their gates. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. And in the rural South, where most of these workers came from, there had never been much work to begin with. Black men in particular faced unemployment rates that made the national numbers look mild by comparison. In some counties across Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas, 9 out of 10 black workers had no jobs at all. They had families to feed, rent to pay, and absolutely no options. So when word spread that a company was hiring in West Virginia, paying real wages for tunnel work, men traveled hundreds of miles for the chance. They came from Alabama and Georgia and Florida and the Carolinas. They came on foot and by freight train and crowded into the backs of trucks. They came with nothing but the clothes they wore and the hope that this job might be different from all the others. The recruiters who found them made big promises. 50 cents an hour, company housing, steady work for months or even years. For men who hadn't seen a regular paycheck in their lives, it sounded like salvation. What the recruiters didn't mention was what they'd be breathing once they got inside that mountain. And the company doing the hiring was called the New Kanawha Power Company. On paper, it was an independent contractor based in West Virginia. In reality, it was a subsidiary of Union Carbide, one of the largest chemical corporations in America. The connection was deliberately obscured, buried in corporate paperwork, so that when things went wrong, the parent company could claim ignorance. And the tunnel they were digging had nothing to do with charity or job creation. Union Carbide needed the tunnel to divert the New River and generate hydroelectric power for their metal processing plants downstream in Alloy, West Virginia. The electricity would power furnaces that turned silica into the steel alloys that made Union Carbide rich. The irony is almost too perfect to be accidental. They were digging through the very mineral they planned to process, and the men doing the digging would become the first casualties of that process, their lungs filled with the raw material of American industry. The project was simple in concept. Dig a tunnel 3 3/4 miles straight through Gauley Mountain, line it with concrete, divert the New River through the tunnel, use the water flow to spin turbines, generate cheap electricity. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong, and everything did. The first sign of trouble came before the first shovel hit rock. Geologists had surveyed the mountain and discovered something unusual about its composition. The rock inside Gali Mountain wasn't ordinary sandstone or granite or the soft shale common to that region. It was almost pure silica. 99.4% pure, to be exact. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. The mountain was essentially made of glass. Now, if you know anything about mining or tunneling or industrial hygiene, that number should make your blood run cold. Silica dust, when inhaled, does something terrible to human lungs. The microscopic particles are sharp, almost crystalline in structure. They lodge in the soft tissue of the alveoli, those tiny air sacs, where oxygen passes from the air into your bloodstream. And once they're there, they don't come out. Your body tries to fight them the way it fights any foreign invader. It sends white blood cells to surround the silica particles and destroy them. But silica can't be digested or dissolved or broken down by any biological process. So the white blood cells die, and more arrive, and more die. And slowly, over weeks and months, scar tissue builds up around each tiny shard of glass in your lungs. The medical term for this is silica fibrosis, or silicosis. The common name used in medical literature is miner's lung or grinder's disease. The men who worked in the Hawk's Nest Tunnel called it by another name entirely. They called it the death fog. Here's what the company knew before the first worker ever stepped foot inside that tunnel. They knew the silica content was lethally high. They had commissioned the geological surveys themselves. They knew that silicosis was a recognized occupational disease with well-established safety protocols that had been developed over decades of hard experience in mines and quarries around the world. Wet drilling. That was the first line of defense. And spray water on the rock face as you drill, and the dust particles bind to the water instead of floating in the air. It's not perfect, but it reduces exposure by 80 or 90%. Proper ventilation. That was the second line of defense. Install fans and ductwork to cycle fresh air into the tunnel and pull the contaminated air out. Create positive airflow so that workers are always breathing air that's been recently replaced. Respirators. That was the third line of defense. Give every worker a proper dust mask, not a cloth bandana, but an actual fitted respirator with replaceable filters. Make mask use mandatory. Fire anyone who refuses to wear protection. These weren't experimental technologies. They weren't cutting-edge innovations that no one had heard of. They'd been standard practice in mining operations for decades. The Bureau of Mines had published guidelines. The insurance industry had established protocols. The knowledge existed. The equipment existed. The only thing missing was the will to use it. And here's what the company did with that knowledge. Nothing. The company chose dry drilling because it was faster. Dry drilling meant the rock shattered into fine powder that hung in the air like fog. You couldn't see more than a few feet in front of your face. You breathed silica with every breath, but dry drilling was faster than wet drilling, and faster meant cheaper, and cheaper meant more profit. They skipped the ventilation because it was expensive. A proper ventilation system for a tunnel that size would have cost tens of thousands of dollars to install and maintain. And why spend that money on workers who could be replaced for $1.25 a day? The math was simple. Dead workers cost nothing. Ventilation cost money. The decision made itself. They refused to provide respirators because, frankly, they didn't care whether the workers lived or died. Some workers bought their own cloth masks with their own wages, cutting into the pittance they were sending home to their families. But cloth masks do nothing against silica particles. The fibers are too fine. They pass right through the weave. You might as well hold a handkerchief over your face in a sandstorm. The men who entered that tunnel had no idea what they were breathing. They'd been told it was just rock dust. Unpleasant, sure. It got in your eyes and your hair and your clothes, but dangerous? Nobody mentioned dangerous. Some foremen actually told workers that the dust was good for them, that it would clear out their lungs, that it was healthier than the humid air outside. Whether they believed this themselves or were simply repeating what they'd been told to say, we'll never know. But the workers trusted them. Why wouldn't they? These were the men in charge. These were the men who signed the paychecks. Imagine believing that. Imagine walking into that darkness every morning, breathing air so thick with silica that you couldn't see the man standing 3 feet away and believing you were doing something healthy. Believing you were lucky to have this job. Believing that the burning in your throat and the tightness in your chest were just signs that your body was adapting, getting stronger, becoming more capable. By the time you realized the truth, it was already too late. The tunnel itself was a nightmare made of stone and darkness and unbreathable air, 3 3/4 miles long, roughly 30 feet in diameter. The workers entered through the main portal and walked into absolute blackness. The only light came from the carbide lamps they wore strapped to their heads, and even those couldn't penetrate the dust. The noise was constant and overwhelming. Jackhammers screaming against rock, pneumatic drills hammering into the tunnel face, the thunder of dynamite blasts that shook the walls and sent fresh clouds of silica billowing through the shaft. And cutting through it all, the shouts of foremen pushing the men to work faster. Always faster. Time was money. Every day of delay cost the company thousands. Yet the temperature inside fluctuated wildly, depending on where you were in the tunnel and what work was being done around you. Near the drilling face, where the jackhammers bit into fresh rock, it was often over 100 degrees from the friction of steel against stone. The air was so hot and so thick with dust that men sweated through their clothes within minutes and still felt like they were suffocating. Further back in the tunnel, where the concrete crews worked to line the walls, it could be 50 degrees cooler. The temperature swings made it impossible for bodies to adjust. Men went from sweating to shivering and back again in the course of a single shift. And there was no escape from the dust. It coated everything. It got into your eyes and your ears and your mouth. It worked its way under your fingernails and into the creases of your skin. Workers described coming home at the end of a shift and coughing up gray sputum for hours, hacking and spitting into buckets until their throats were raw. Their wives said they could tell who worked in the tunnel just by looking at the color of the rings they left around the bathtub. Gray. Always gray. The work schedule was punishing even by the standards of Depression-era labor. The company ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There were no days off. There were no holidays. Christmas and New Year's and Easter came and went, and the drilling continued. The only thing that mattered was progress, measured in feet of tunnel carved out of the mountain. And the men kept coming. Even as rumors started spreading about the dust, even as workers started getting sick, even as bodies started piling up, they kept coming because what choice did they have? Where else were they going to find work that paid 50 cents an hour in the middle of the worst economic crisis in American history? The first men started dying within weeks of the project's beginning. It happened quietly at first, in ways that were easy to miss or explain away. A worker would develop a cough, nothing serious, just a tickle in the throat, the kind of thing anyone might get from working in a dusty environment. He'd take a pull of whiskey and go back to work, but the cough would get worse. It would keep him awake at night. It would leave him winded after climbing a single flight of stairs. He'd start losing weight, losing strength, losing the ability to keep up with the younger men on his crew. Then came the fevers, the night sweats, the blood and the sputum, and then, one morning, he wouldn't show up for his shift. His body would be found in one of the company's shacks, or in a rooming house in town, or in the tunnel itself, still wearing his work clothes, his lamp still strapped to his forehead. The company had a system for dealing with the dead. It was efficient. It was quick. It was designed to attract as little attention as possible. If a man died in the tunnel, 2 workers would carry him out and leave him by the portal. They weren't supposed to stop working, just detail 2 men to move the body and get back to the drilling. A company truck would come by at the end of the shift and collect whatever bodies had accumulated. If the dead man had family in the area, they might be notified. If not, as the body went into a truck with the others. Some of the dead were buried in the local cemetery at Somersville, about 20 miles away. Individual graves, headstones, the appearance of respect. But as the death toll climbed from dozens to scores to hundreds, the company decided that individual burials were too expensive and too conspicuous, so they started digging mass graves. On a plot of land near the tunnel site, in a field that had once been a cornfield, workers reported seeing bodies stacked 3 deep in holes that were barely deep enough to cover them. No coffins, no grave liners, just bodies wrapped in canvas, thrown into pits, covered with quicite to speed decomposition, and buried under a thin layer of dirt. No headstones, no markers, no records of who was buried where. Just bodies in the ground, covered with West Virginia clay, and forgotten. The exact location of these mass graves has been debated for decades. Some researchers believe they've identified the site. Others argue that there may have been multiple burial locations. The company destroyed the records, and the witnesses are long dead. The bodies remain wherever they were put, unmarked and unmourned. The living weren't treated much better than the dead. Workers who became too sick to work were simply fired and evicted from company housing. They received no compensation, no severance, no medical care, no acknowledgement that their illness had anything to do with their employment. Many of them had no money to return home. The wages they'd earned had already been sent to families down south. They stayed in the area, living in shacks and abandoned buildings, Wes getting sicker and sicker until they joined their former co-workers in those unmarked graves. Some workers tried to see doctors, but the company had an understanding with local physicians. Any doctor who diagnosed silicosis in a tunnel worker would find himself cut off from the company's business. No more treating the foremen and their families. No more consulting contracts. No more referrals. And since the company employed a significant portion of the local population, directly or indirectly, that was a threat most doctors took seriously. It was safer, professionally speaking, to diagnose tuberculosis or pneumonia or some other condition that carried no liability for employers. So that's what they did. The few physicians who did examine tunnel workers and record honest diagnoses found their reports buried in filing cabinets, lost in bureaucratic shuffles, or simply ignored. One doctor, examining a dying worker, wrote that he had never seen lungs so badly damaged in a living patient. The tissue was like cement, he said. The patient couldn't pull enough air into his body to speak above a whisper. That report disappeared. No one acted on it. The drilling continued. Meanwhile, the company's own medical staff actively suppressed evidence of the epidemic unfolding in their tunnel. Workers who complained of breathing problems were given cough syrup and aspirin and told to get back to work. Those who persisted were informed that they had tuberculosis, a diagnosis that conveniently shifted responsibility away from the company. Tuberculosis was understood to be a contagious disease that workers brought with them. It had nothing to do with employment conditions. The company knew this was a lie. They knew exactly what was killing these men. They just didn't care as long as the tunnel got dug. By the middle of 1931, barely a year into the project, the death rate had become impossible to ignore completely. Workers were dying so fast that the company couldn't replace them quickly enough to maintain production schedules. Foremen were sometimes grabbing drills and working alongside skeleton crews because there weren't enough healthy men to run a full shift. The company's solution was not to improve conditions. It was to recruit more aggressively, to send more labor agents into the rural South, to make bigger promises, to keep the pipeline of disposable workers flowing at a rate that could absorb the losses, and still the work continued. What did it sound like to die of silicosis? The survivors and the family members who watched their loved ones die described it in terms that are difficult to read and impossible to forget. It started with the cough, a dry, hacking cough that wouldn't stop no matter how much water you drank or how long you rested. The cough would get deeper as weeks passed, wetter, more productive. You'd start bringing up material. Gray at first, then tinged with pink, then with unmistakable red. Your body was trying to clear the debris from your lungs, but the silica particles were embedded too deeply. They couldn't be coughed up, so your lungs kept producing mucus, trying to flush out invaders that would never leave, and the mucus had nowhere to go but up and out through your throat. Then came the weight loss. Your body was burning calories just to breathe, and spending energy it couldn't spare on the simple act of pulling air into damaged lungs. Food didn't taste right anymore. Eating made you cough. Coughing exhausted you. So you ate less and less, and your body consumed itself to keep the essential organs running. Men who had entered the tunnel weighing 180 pounds, strong enough to swing a sledgehammer for 10 hours straight, would weigh 120 by the time they died. Their wives would describe them as skeletons with skin stretched over bone. Their children wouldn't recognize them. Then the color changed. Your skin would turn gray first, as the oxygen in your blood dropped to critical levels. Then came blue, starting at the fingertips and the lips, spreading inward as your body prioritized the vital organs. Your fingernails would take on a purple tinge, acrim. The whites of your eyes would go yellow as your liver began to fail under the strain of trying to keep the rest of you alive. And finally, the drowning. That's what the doctors called it, the ones who were honest about what they were seeing. Pulmonary edema. Your lungs would fill with fluid that your scarred tissues couldn't clear, and you would slowly, over hours or days, drown in your own secretions. You could hear it happening. A gurgling sound with every breath, a bubbling in the chest. There was no treatment. There was no relief. There was no way to reverse the damage or slow the progression. Once the silica was in your lungs, it was there forever, and your body would fight it until your body gave out. Some men died quickly, within months of their first exposure. Others lingered for years, getting progressively weaker, until a simple cold or a flu finished what the tunnel had started. The youngest worker known to have died from Hawks Nest Tunnel silicosis was 15 years old. He'd lied about his age to get the job. The oldest was in his 60s, a man who had survived decades of hard labor only to have his lungs turned to stone in a West Virginia mountain. Most were in their 20s and 30s, young men, fathers with children at home, sons with parents depending on them, men who should have had 4 or 5 decades of life ahead of them. They died in company shacks and boarding houses and by the sides of roads. They died in the tunnel itself, sometimes while still holding their drills, collapsing face first into the rock they'd been cutting. They died in the arms of wives who had traveled from Alabama or Georgia to be with them in their final days. They died in hospitals that had no idea how to treat them. They died alone in ditches and fields where no one found them for days or weeks. And the company kept records of none of it. The tunnel was completed in 1935. It came in under budget and ahead of schedule, just as the executives had promised their shareholders. Union Carbide congratulated itself on a job well done. Bonuses were distributed, promotions were awarded, but the dying hadn't stopped. For many workers, the worst was still to come. Silicosis is not a fast killer. It can take months or years to reach its terminal stage, depending on the intensity and duration of exposure. Men who had seemed relatively healthy when they left the project in 1932 or 1933 were now collapsing, unable to work, unable to breathe. The disease had been progressing silently inside them, and now it was claiming its due. These men were scattered across the South, dying in ones and twos in small towns far from Gauley Bridge. Their deaths were recorded as pneumonia, tuberculosis, heart failure, anything but the truth. Their families knew something was wrong, knew that healthy young men didn't just waste away and die, but they had no way to prove the connection and no one to complain to, even if they could. It took a journalist to break the silence. In 1935, a reporter named Albert Maltz published an article about the Hawks Nest Tunnel in a magazine called New Masses. The piece was titled Man on the Road, and it told the story of an encounter with a dying tunnel worker who was trying to make his way home to Florida. The man was skeletal, Maltz wrote. He was coughing blood. He could barely walk. He knew he was dying, and he didn't have money for a bus ticket. So he was hitchhiking south, hoping that someone would pick him up and carry him a few miles closer to his family before the end came. The article caused a sensation. For the first time, the American public was confronted with the scope of what had happened in a West Virginia tunnel that most people had never heard of. Letters poured into the magazine's offices. Other journalists started investigating, and pressure began building, slowly at first and then with increasing urgency, for some kind of official response. In January 1936, the House of Representatives convened a subcommittee to investigate the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster. The hearings were held in Washington, and they lasted for weeks. Witnesses testified about the conditions in the tunnel, the lack of safety equipment, the mass graves, the systematic cover-up that had kept the truth hidden for years. The evidence that emerged was overwhelming and damning. A company memo surfaced showing that executives had been warned about the silica content before construction ever began. Geologists had flagged the unusual composition of the rock. Industrial hygienists had recommended wet drilling and proper ventilation. The company had received this advice, considered it, and rejected it as too expensive and too slow. Medical records were introduced showing that the company's own doctors had diagnosed silicosis in hundreds of workers, then systematically changed those diagnoses to tuberculosis or pneumonia to avoid liability. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. It was policy. Workers who had survived testified about the conditions they'd endured, the darkness, the dust, the threats from foremen who warned them that complaining would get them fired and blacklisted. One man described being told that if he didn't like the conditions, there were 100 others outside the tunnel who would be happy to take his place. In the middle of the Depression, that wasn't an idle threat. The mass graves were documented in testimony. Workers who had helped dig the pits and bury the bodies described what they'd seen. Photographs were introduced into evidence, grainy and indistinct but unmistakable. Bodies stacked in shallow trenches. Quick light spread over the dead to speed decomposition. Dirt shoveled on top and tamped down. And through it all, through weeks of devastating testimony and documentary evidence, Union Carbide and its subsidiary denied responsibility. Their lawyers argued that silicosis was a natural disease, not caused by employment conditions, but by individual susceptibility. Some people got it, some didn't. It was a matter of personal constitution, not corporate negligence. They claimed the workers had been negligent in failing to protect themselves. If the dust was so bad, why didn't they quit? Why didn't they demand masks? Why didn't they refuse to work under unsafe conditions? The implication was clear. These men had chosen their fate. They suggested that many of the deaths were actually caused by pre-existing conditions, tuberculosis, pneumonia, the kinds of diseases that poor rural black men were prone to. Nothing to do with the tunnel, just unfortunate coincidence. The subcommittee listened to all of this. They reviewed the evidence, they interviewed dozens of witnesses, they compiled a report, and then they did almost nothing. The final report acknowledged that somewhere between 476 and 764 workers had died as a direct result of silica exposure in the Hawks Nest Tunnel. It criticized the company for inadequate safety measures. It recommended stricter federal regulation of occupational hazards in the future. But there were no criminal referrals. No executives were named as personally responsible for the deaths. No meaningful penalties were assessed against the company or its officers. The workers' families did file civil lawsuits, hundreds of them. Over time, more than 200 cases were consolidated into a single action against the new Kanawha Power Company and its parent corporations. The families wanted justice. They wanted compensation. They wanted someone to acknowledge that their husbands and fathers and sons had been murdered for profit. Union Carbide's lawyers fought every claim with the full resources of one of America's largest corporations. They filed motion after motion. They demanded documentation that the families didn't have because the company had destroyed it. They dragged out the proceedings for years, knowing that many of the plaintiffs would die before the cases were resolved. In the end, worn down and impoverished, the families settled. The total amount paid by the company was approximately $130,000. Split among hundreds of families after lawyers' fees were deducted, that worked out to a few $100s per death. Some families received nothing at all because they couldn't prove their loved one had worked in the tunnel. The employment records had been destroyed, and the company swore no such records had ever existed. $130,000 for what may have been the largest mass killing of workers in American industrial history, less than the cost of the executives' annual bonuses. And then, somehow, impossibly, the story disappeared. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster never became part of our national memory the way the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire did, or the Titanic sinking, or any of a dozen other industrial tragedies from the same era. It wasn't taught in schools, it wasn't memorialized in museums, it faded from public consciousness within a few years of the congressional hearings. Why? The answer is uncomfortable, but necessary to confront. The tunnel workers were poor. They were rural. They were predominantly black. In an era when black lives were valued at somewhere close to zero, by the legal and political systems that might have protected them. They had no advocates with power. They had no organizations to keep their memory alive. They had no voices that the wider world was prepared to listen to. The mass graves were plowed over and planted with grass. The tunnel itself kept operating year after year, generating electricity for Union Carbide's factories. The widows and orphans scattered back to their home states, carrying their grief to graves that would never be marked. For decades, the Hawks Nest disaster was mentioned only in specialized academic texts and obscure labor history archives. It was a footnote, a curiosity, something that happened to people who didn't matter, in a place no one had heard of a long time ago. But the dead don't stay buried forever. In the 1970s, a physician and researcher named Martin Cherniak began investigating the Hawks Nest disaster. He spent years tracking down survivors. He filed Freedom of Information requests. He dug through boxes of court records that had been moldering in storage since the 1930s. He interviewed witnesses who had stayed silent for 4 decades, afraid to speak while the company still had power over their lives. His book, The Hawks Nest Incident, was published in 1986. It remains the most comprehensive account of what happened in that tunnel, and it asks a question that still hasn't been adequately answered. How do you kill 476 people in broad daylight with full knowledge of what you're doing and walk away without consequences? The answer is power. Union Carbide was one of the largest corporations in America. They had lawyers on retainer. They had lobbyists in Washington. They had connections in Congress and state legislatures. They had the ability to destroy anyone who got in their way. The workers had none of that. They had only their labor, and once that was used up, once their lungs were too full of glass to draw another breath, they had nothing at all. The answer is also racism. We cannot understand Hawks Nest without understanding that the men who died were, in the eyes of the system that killed them, expendable in a way that white workers might not have been. A congressional committee could express horror at their deaths and still conclude that no one should be held personally accountable. That was simply how things worked in America in the 1930s. And the answer is also memory. We remember the disasters that fit neatly into our national narratives. We remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire because it led to reforms, to labor laws, to a better future. The deaths meant something. They purchased something. The Hawks Nest workers died, and nothing changed. No major laws were passed. No industry was reformed. The company that killed them continued to operate, continued to make money, continued to prosper. Their deaths were merely evidence of how cheap certain lives were in industrial America. Today, there is a small historical marker near the site of the Hawks Nest Tunnel. It was installed in 2012, more than 80 years after the disaster began. The marker summarizes the basic facts in a few sentences. A tunnel was dug. Workers were exposed to silica. Many died. A tragedy. It doesn't mention that no one was ever punished. It doesn't mention the mass graves, which still exist somewhere beneath the grass of that West Virginia hillside. It doesn't mention Union Carbide by name. The tunnel is still there. It still diverts the New River. It still generates electricity. If you drive along Route 60 near Gauley Bridge, you can see the portal where thousands of men walked into the mountain and hundreds never walked out. I've been thinking about what we owe the dead. The phrase sounds abstract, almost philosophical, until you consider what it means in practice. We owe them memory. We owe them the refusal to let their deaths disappear into comfortable silence. We owe them the willingness to say their names, to describe how they suffered, to insist that what happened to them was a crime even if no court ever acknowledged it. We owe them anger, not the performative anger of social media, the kind that flares up and fades within a news cycle, but the sustained, uncomfortable anger that demands that we look at what we would rather not see. The tunnel workers died because they were considered expendable by people with more power than them. They died because their lives were worth less than the cost of a ventilation system. That should make us angry. And we should stay angry because the same calculations are being made today in workplaces across this country and around the world. And we owe them learning. The Hawks Nest disaster wasn't a fluke. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a case of good intentions gone wrong. It was the predictable, preventable result of a system that valued profit over human life and assumed that certain workers were too powerless to object. That system hasn't gone away. It's changed forms, found new victims, developed new methods of obscuring responsibility. But the logic is identical. And the only way to fight it is to understand where it comes from. The men who died in the Hawks Nest tunnel were not heroes, at least not in the way we usually use that word. They didn't charge into danger knowingly. They didn't sacrifice themselves for a cause. They were just men looking for work, trying to feed their families, doing the only jobs available to them in the middle of an economic catastrophe. And they were killed for it. There's something unbearable about that simplicity. We want our martyrs to have chosen their suffering. We want their deaths to have meaning, to have purchased something worth the price. But the tunnel workers purchased nothing except slightly cheaper electricity for a corporation that never acknowledged what it had done. They died so that Union Carbide could generate power a few months earlier than planned. They died so that executives could meet a deadline. They died so that shareholders could see marginally better returns. And then they were forgotten. Until now. Until you heard their story. Until their names, or at least the memory of what was done to them, entered your consciousness and became impossible to ignore. That's what we owe the dead. The refusal to let them disappear. The insistence that they mattered even if the world that killed them believed otherwise. Shirley Jones, the man I mentioned at the beginning, who walked out of that tunnel in 1931 coughing so hard he couldn't stand upright. He was 32 years old when the silica started filling his lungs. He was one of at least 476, probably one of 764 or more. He died so that electricity could flow a few months earlier and a corporation could save a few $1,000s on safety equipment. He deserved better. They all deserve better. And the least we can do, 8 decades later, is remember. If this story made you think about the cost of progress, about what we've built in this country and who paid for it with their lives, subscribe to this channel. I cover the forgotten disasters and hidden histories that shape the nation we live in today. The men who died in the Hawks Nest tunnel aren't in most history books. They aren't in most museums, but they should be. And now, at least, you know their story.